Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 39, A Cry in the Crisis. Economic professor Paul Romer from Stanford University quipped one time that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. That might or might not be true in economics. I do think it's true in the spiritual realm. As we come to Psalm 39, we notice we have the superscription for the choir director for Jeduthun. Now that term Jeduthun, and notice it's also a Psalm of David, but Jeduthun is mentioned in First Chronicles chapter 25, actually a number of times in First Chronicles, where we find out that he's one of the priestly musicians. Indeed, his family, his sons, are going to serve as temple musicians, continuing there in First Chronicles 25, and in other places they are described as the keepers of the gates. Now, in some of those other places, it refers to them, the children of or sons of Jeduthun. It might be a different Jeduthun. It's not all that uncommon of a name, I suppose. Um, so I'm not sure if these are the same sons that were keepers of the gates, but it well could be. Notice the psalm begins, I said, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth as with a muzzle. So notice with regard to the tongue and with regard to the mouth, the things that he says while the wicked are in my presence. Notice he does this so that he won't sin. And notice also the reference to the wicked. There's a problem here, potential sin. And it takes us back to the previous chapter we saw in Psalm 38. There was a confession of sin and a plea for an end to discipline. Now, and I think these are arranged in order. We're going to see this next time in chapter 40. But now in chapter 39, we see a determination not to sin any longer and a request to be restored. A request which, by the time we get to the end of this psalm, will not yet have been answered. But we'll see that when we get there. Verse 2, I was mute and silent. I refrained even from good. Now, when he says I refrained even from good, I don't think that means that he wasn't doing any good things, but that rather he remained silent, not even speaking good things. It's in the context of speaking. And he continues, and my sorrow grew worse. My heart was hot within me. Now, remember how we looked at that idea back in the previous chapter of the heated one, don't get too heated, and that sort of idea. Same idea. I don't think it's the same term, but the same idea here. My heart was hot within me. While I was musing, the fire burned, and then I spoke with my tongue, and this is all leading up to what he's going to say. So now he speaks, and he's going to pray for, this is going to be the rest of the chapter, he's going to pray for a heavenly perspective, that will be in verses 4 through 6, for deliverance from chastening and the sin that caused it, verses 7 through 11, and finally, the last couple of verses, he'll pray for restoration. But the prayer, at least while we're reading it, isn't going to be answered. So this is one of those times where he was mute and silent, but then he speaks. And in the meantime, he gets the feeling that heaven is also mute and silent. He begins, as we said, asking for a perspective. Here we see it, verse 4, Lord, make me to know my end and what is the extent of my days. So he's asking, and this is two ways of saying the same thing, to know two things, my end, what is the extent of my days. Let me know, he says again, how transient I am. And one of the things that you get to see as you get older, and I don't know for sure that the psalmist here is older, but he sounds like it. He sounds like he's been through quite a few experiences. Let me just say for the record, I'm an old guy. I've been through quite a few experiences. And it's not that you necessarily get wisdom with age, but what you do get, you get perspective. You get to see things that have happened over the course of your lifetime. So he says, make me to know my end, the extent of my days, how transient I am, how I'm here today and gone tomorrow, and how quickly it all went by. Verse 5, behold, you have made my days as handbreadths. In other words, they seem to have gone by so quickly. I turned around and I was, 70 plus years old, and it just seems like nothing. And my lifetime as nothing in your sight. Surely every man at his best is a mere breath. Selah. And Selah is probably some sort of pause, maybe a musical notation. But notice the point that he's making, the perspective that he has received, is how short life really is. Verse 6, surely every man walks about as a phantom. And we have to pause there for this term here, bet salem. The term, the bet is just the preposition, in or as here. But salem is actually the term that we have used back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, to describe when man was made in the, not the phantom, but in the image of God. And so it has that sense here. We could go, every man walks about as an image, but that doesn't really capture the idea. The Old King James rendered it, surely every man walketh in a vain show. The New English translation goes, surely people go through life as mere ghosts. That's the phantom idea. The ESV, English Standard Version, says, surely a man goes about as a shadow. They're all trying to capture the idea behind this. And I think the idea is that, yes, you're here, and not saying that you're a ghost, but you're here so quickly. It just that your life is here and then you dissipate. The New Jerusalem Bible translates the entire verse like this: every human being that walks only a shadow, a mere puff of wind. And now they're trying to expand on it a bit. That's not a literal translation, but that's okay. It might be getting the idea across. A mere puff of wind is the wealth stored away, and no knowing who will profit from it. And I know that's a little hard to capture, but that might actually carry the idea behind this. It's that your life seems almost ethereal. It almost seems like a, well. Notice how he captures a puff of wind or a vapor. It reminds us of the language of Ecclesiastes. Notice that mere puff of wind, that is reminiscent of the words. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, beginning verse 17. This is the preacher, the one who had been king in Israel, who was doing all these great works and amassing all this glory and money and pleasure. And he comes to the point where he says, so I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after the wind. Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor, for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. Now, notice that idea. I don't know if what's going to become of it. I built up this great kingdom. By the way, Solomon seems to be the author there. You remember Solomon's son comes after him and quickly loses the kingdom. Verse 19, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool, yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. So here's this idea that's described as striving after the wind. This too is, notice I must leave it to the man who comes after me. And this too is vanity. That term vanity, Abel, is literally vapor. It's like trying to nail jelly or jello onto a tree. It just doesn't stick, and life just doesn't stick. And I think that was the idea in Ecclesiastes, but that's also here the idea in Psalms. So notice he said, surely every man will walk about as a phantom. That is, he's just not going to stick. Surely they make an uproar for nothing. He amasses riches and does not know who will gather them. You don't know how it's all going to turn out. And so the amassing of riches doesn't know who's going to gather them. Reminds me of a time when my grandkids were very, very young. Now they're adults now, but back then they were very young, and we all sat down to play this game of Monopoly. And of course, you go round and round and round, and eventually somebody in the game, I think it was my grandson who finally did it, got all the money, and he won the game. And my little granddaughter, she was heartbroken. She lost all the money in the game, and I took her in my lap and I said, honey, it's okay. When we're done, it all goes back into the box. Nobody gets to keep it. And after I said that, I thought, that's a good analogy for life. We live this life here under the sun. I'm not talking about spiritual life. I'm just talking about the life that we have here. And when you're done, it all goes back into the box, even your body. And so living for things down here, amassing riches and walking about and without the Lord in perspective, and that's why this is the section on perspective. It all goes back in the box, and it all doesn't mean a whole lot unless you have an eternal perspective. And so we go now to the theme of deliverance, verse 7. And now, O Lord, for what do I wait? And that's a rhetorical question. It's sort of obvious, and he answers it immediately. My hope is in you. You are my hope. If you don't deliver, I won't be delivered. It reminds me of the words of Peter in John chapter 6, where all of the crowds had heard the very difficult teaching of Jesus, and they all abandoned him. And Jesus turned to the 12 disciples, and he says to them, "Are you guys going to leave too?" And it's Peter who speaks up and says, Where can we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. Another way he could have said that, my hope is in you. And now he makes the request for deliverance. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Remember how we saw in the last chapter, the focus had been on his transgressions, how he was getting, at least in some cases, the results of those. And so, again, he repeats that request. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Make me not the reproach of the foolish. I have become mute, and this is going to be the language of faith. Um, he makes the request in verse 8, but in verse 9, I have become mute. I do not open my mouth because it is you who have done it. I'm going to stop trying to defend myself. I'm going to trust in you. And that's why I call this section the language of faith. Verse 10, he's still asking for deliverance. So he says, first of verse 10, remove your plague from me. And in asking for this, he is recognizing that it's not his worldly enemies that are the big threat, but really it's the hand of the Lord. Notice, because of the opposition of your hand, I'm perishing. With reproofs, you chasten a man for iniquity. You consume as a moth what is precious to him. That is, it really depends, Lord, on you. You are the one that has brought these bad things into my life, and you can take them out. Either way. But notice how we end again, going back to that Ecclesiastes idea. Surely every man is a mere breath. Life is short, and then you die. And then what? Then is the real question. And notice how we have that pause. They say, well, either musical notation or maybe a call for us just to pause. We can take it as such because we're not playing any music right now. But let's pause and then go to the next verse. Now verses 12 and 13. And here is the cry for restoration. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Do not be silent at my tears, for I am a stranger with you, a sojourner, like all my fathers. Notice stranger and sojourner, two different ways of saying the same thing. So he's asking for deliverance, for restoration, and he's recognizing that he has been cut off, and we already noted this. This is a honor and shame culture where family and friends, that was greatly prized, but he's apart from all that. I'm a stranger with you, a sojourner like all my fathers. Verse 13, turn your gaze away from me, that I may smile again. And he's asking for relief from the presence of God's judgment. Turn your gaze away from me that I may smile again before I depart and am no more. And that's how the psalm ends. It ends with no resolution. Why does it do that? Why does the psalm end this way? I think there are two reasons. First of all, because his story is our story, and because our story is not over yet. We are still in the midst of the story. We're still in the middle of our own story. And sometimes you look at it and you wonder, how's this thing going to end? It's not over yet. My wife likes to say, while you still draw breath, there is hope. And I think the psalmist has that idea too, because we come to a close and he's asking, but we haven't seen the answer yet. It's like, I think of some books that end like that. The book of Job ends with a question, and you're supposed to supply the answer. And here, you can't supply the answer because you don't know how it's going to end yet, but you're in that tension of the in-between place. And so the end isn't always in sight. Sometimes, you're not there yet, and you can't see how it's going to end, but you're still trusting in the Lord for that ending. And that tells me that we walk by faith and not by sight. Let me just say, walking by sight is a lot more comfortable. It's nice to be able to see where you're walking, where you're putting your steps, but we're called to walk by faith. And that means we can live securely even when the end isn't in sight. So, because his story is our story, but also because there is an end to the story, even if we can't see it yet. And so that's going to come in the next chapter. We're not going to do that right now, but when we get to the next chapter, chapter 40, we're going to see that the end, not the final end, but the end to that question mark has arrived, and he's back with the Lord, and he has been restored. We'll see that next time.